Hello and welcome to my channel, I Want to Lose Gaming. With the recent OP weapon banners like the Homa and the Elegy, and the current Freedom Soaring Sword and Song of Broken Pines, I think it's a great opportunity to talk about a 5-star weapon tier list. Nowadays, even some long-time free-to-play players have been considering whether or not they should pull on the weapon banner. It's high time we take a look at all the 5-star weapons in the game. Currently, there are 24 5-star weapons to rank in today's tier list video. Now before continuing, only pull on the weapon banner if you're aware of and comfortable with the risks involved. While the pity counter carries over to the next weapon banner, the epitomized path does not. I've already made a video explaining this in detail, and I'll have a link to that video in the description below. For this video, I'll be ranking weapons in 2 different tier lists. That's right, you guys are getting 2 tier lists for the price of 1 video. What a great deal. Anyway, the first tier list is a more free-to-play friendly focused tier list. I'd say most free-to-play players, even up to this point, don't have very many non-standard 5-star weapons. Universality and the power gap between these 5-star weapons and their alternatives become much more important in this free-to-play tier list. All weapons on this free-to-play tier list are considered only at Refinement 1. The tiers for this tier list, the free-to-play tier list, are as follows. The S tier, aka the cream of the crop, is reserved for weapons that are often considered to be both universal and also provide a large power spike. If you're thinking about pulling on the weapon banner, and if that banner has something in the S tier and let's say another good weapon, then that would be a highly recommended weapon banner to pull on. The A tier weapons are still great weapons, but I either only recommend these weapons for very specific characters, or these weapons are super universal but not necessarily too overpowered. And next we have the B tier, which are often considered good weapons, but at this point I do not recommend pulling for them. However, if they happen to be the second weapon on a banner that you're interested in, perhaps you can consider them. Afterwards we have the C tier. These weapons are not considered completely useless, but are weapons that I do not recommend pulling for. And lastly, we have the D tier, which can just be accurately summarized with this frowny emoji. These weapons are either power crept or provide minuscule benefits to their alternatives. Another way to look at this list as a whole is it worth a free-to-play player's primo gems to pull on the weapon banner, assuming you get the weapon in a reasonable amount of pulls. Now for the second tier list, which I will be calling the Dolphin Plus tier list. The Dolphin Plus tier list is for people that spend some money in Genshin Impact and may have quite a few characters and even some 5-star weapons. This list focuses more so on end-game combat potential. In particular, this list is great for dolphins or whales, or even some free-to-plays honestly, looking for the best 5-star weapons to take their accounts to the next level. Refinements are also considered on this tier list. The tiers for this list are S rank for essentially irreplaceable. Weapons in this category have no substitute for what they do and are often the best in slot weapon for some of the best characters in the game. The second tier is the A tier, or situationally the best. These weapons are amazing weapons, but often have situations where another weapon is just as good or even a little better. Either that, or the weapon is limited in usage to maybe just one top tier character. The third tier is B tier, which is what I will call the occasionally good tier. Weapons in this category are decent and usable and can even occasionally outperform weapons in the tier above, but they are considered to be much more niche in general. And the lowest tier for this list is the C tier, which is the power crept tier. The weapons in this tier are almost never the best option to use because there are simply better options. So how will I be ranking an individual weapon? I will be considering the characters that can effectively utilize this weapon, the impact it will have on the overall power level of your account, and whether or not this weapon has been power crept, and how does it compare to its alternatives. I'm going to try to go through each weapon quickly, and with how many weapons there are, obviously I won't be able to cover all the details and nuances for every single weapon. If there's an important detail about a weapon that you feel like I missed, be sure to let us know in the comments below. Without further ado, let's finally get started. We'll start off with the swords in Genshin Impact. Starting with the very first sword to be featured on a weapon banner, we have the Aquila Favonia. The Aquila Favonia has aged remarkably well as one of Bennett's best in slot weapons. We all know how broken Bennett is, and being the best in slot weapon for the most broken character in the game is quite something else. But you might be surprised to see me place it in the B tier for the free to play tier list. The reason for this is simple. It's because as far as Bennett is concerned, the Aquila Favonia has been power crept by the Mist Splitters Reforged, which has the same base attack and provides much more pyro damage. As such, I don't necessarily recommend pulling for this weapon even for Bennett, but as I mentioned earlier, I guess if it happens to be the second weapon on a banner, you can still put this weapon to good use. As for the Dolphin Plus tier list, the Aquila Favonia goes into the A tier, as situationally the best. Because you often don't care about Bennett's damage, you're better off just using the Aquila Favonia on Bennett and slapping the Mist Splitter Reforged on someone else. Here you can already see why I made 2 tier lists, as the Aquila Favonia is a good weapon and in fact situationally tied for one of the best weapons for one of the best characters in the game, aka Bennett. But at the same time, it's not a weapon I recommend a free-to-play player to pull for. Next is the Skyward Blade. I'm throwing this thing straight into the C tier. The Skyward Blade provides some decent stats and some energy recharge. However, it is severely lacking in damage compared to other swords. And if energy recharge is your only or main concern, then Favonius and Sacrificial Sword are often better options. However, it's worth noting that the Skyward Blade is a nice middle ground between energy regeneration and damage, and it also has good base attack, so it's a viable alternative for Bennett instead of the Aquila Favonia or Mist Splitters Reforged. In the Dolphin tier list, I'm also keeping this in the second lowest tier, which is the occasionally good tier, for when you want your Bennett to have 300 plus energy recharge while not losing too much damage on his damage buff. Now for the Summit Shaper, one of the biggest traps in the game. For free-to-plays, I'm putting this weapon into the C tier. The Summit Shaper is a decent damage dealing sword, especially compared to the free-to-play alternatives. Comparing this thing to say the Festering Desire or the Harbinger of Dawn or the Amanoma Kageyuchi, and you'll quickly notice that the Summit Shaper does significantly more damage than all those free-to-play weapons. However, the Summit Shaper is not the best in slot weapon for any sword character, and thus I cannot put it any higher than C tier for free-to-plays. Fortunately, both Ayaka and Keqing usually don't mind building stacks, so this weapon is a usable third best option for them while you have a shield. As for the Dolphin Plus tier list, the Summit Shaper is simply power crept by the next couple of swords on this list. Speaking of a sword that power creeps the Summit Shaper, we have the Jade Cutter. The Jade Cutter provides an outrageous 44.1% crit rate and a ton of attack thanks to its passive. This is the ultimate stat stick for a free-to-play player, and its buff is completely unconditional. As such, I'm throwing this thing into the S tier for free-to-play players. Literally every attack-based sword character will notice a huge spike to their performance in comparison to their free-to-play alternatives. And as we go forward in this tier list, you'll notice that weapons that provide a lot of crits will do well on this list. Well, farming for amazing crit artifacts is very difficult, even for whales. So for free-to-plays, it's a really tall order. Now as for the Dolphin Plus tier list, I have to put the Jade Cutter into the A tier. This is because while it's amazing on all the attack scaling sword characters, it's not going to break your damage output for the most broken characters in the game. However, the Jade Cutter is still an amazing option for characters like Jean, Xingqiu, Keqing, Traveler, and Qiqi. Next we have the Freedom Sword. For free-to-plays, I'm going to place this sword into the A tier. This weapon is actually more flexible than you'd expect, with Kazuha, Albedo, Jean, and even Traveler all able to consistently activate it. Now Refinement 1, this weapon's team buff is nice, but nothing too incredible. Nonetheless, this is the best weapon for literally one of the best characters in the game, Kazuha, and any amount of additional buffs that Kazuha can provide to your team will push his teams even further beyond. On the Dolphin Plus tier list, this thing goes straight into the S tier. Once you start adding some refinements onto it, its buffs become extremely noticeable and you'll start to face roll content way harder than before. This weapon is simply irreplaceable for the power it provides on Kazuha. The last and most recently released 5-star sword is the Mist Splitter Reforged. If you want the ultimate DPS sword in the game, this is it. The Mist Splitter goes straight into the S tier for both free-to-plays and dolphins. This dumb weapon provides up to 40% elemental damage at Refinement 1 and has crit damage as a substat, making this the absolute perfect weapon for Ayaka. And we all know how busted Ayaka is. On top of this, the Mist Splitter is the actual best weapon for Bennett, providing the same damage buff that the Aquila Favonia does and doing much more pyro damage than the Aquila Favonia. It is also arguably better than the Jade Cutter on most of the other sword characters. And finally, if you have Constellation 6 Bennett, any sword character can capitalize on all the stacks from this weapon. Alright, so we finished our first category of weapons, and now let's start with our second category, the bows of Genshin Impact. Starting with the very first bow to be featured on the very first weapon banner, we have the Amos bow. I've got one word for the Amos bow, and that word is Ganyu. The Amos bow is currently the best option for Ganyu's ridiculously broken charge shots. Because Ganyu is one of the best characters in the game, Ganyu alone puts the Amos bow in the A tier for both of the tier lists. However, it's worth noting that the Amos bow kind of underperforms on most of the other characters, but Ganyu alone, like I said, justifies this bow's placement. Next is the Skyward Harp. The Skyward Harp is a crazy stat stick, having the highest base attack, having crit rate, and having crit damage. This thing alone can solve your crit ratio problems, and because the Skyward Harp is overall much more universal than the Amos bow, I'm putting it in the A tier right above the Amos bow. It also happens to be one of the best options for a maximum attack buff on Sara, and is a great option for all the DPS bow characters. And after the Skyward Harp, we have the Elegy for the End. The Elegy for the End is very similar to the Freedom Sworn sword, providing amazing buffs and being usable on so many bow characters. It goes into the A tier for free-to-play players, and straight to the S tier for Dolphin Pluses. At Refinement 1, the buff it provides a free-to-play player's account won't be as high as, for example, having the Mist Splitter Reforged for your Ayaka, and as such, it's not quite at that level of S tier for a free-to-play player. But for Dolphin Pluses and with some refinements, the Elegy for the End quickly becomes an irreplaceable asset for Venti and occasionally Sara. The Elegy is also great on Amber, Cryo Amber, and can be viable on Fischl and Diona as well. Overall, this is an amazing weapon and is one of the best weapons in the entire game. Next we have the Thundering Pulse. I'm putting the Thundering Pulse in A tier for both the tier lists. This weapon is another incredible stat stick, and is the clear best option for normal attack bow users. However, the main abuser of normal attacks for a bow character is Yoimiya. And Yoimiya, while a great character, is definitely not considered to be a broken character, so she alone cannot bring this weapon up to the S tier. Childe is also a great user of this weapon, and the Thundering Pulse provides Childe with his largest possible damage per thumbnail nukes, if of course you're willing to crit fish for them. And that's the thing with the DPS bows, is we actually have quite a few options that are all pretty viable. And that's the perfect segue into the next one, which is the Polar Star. We have another DPS bow that goes into the A tier. Interestingly, the Polar Star provides more average damage than the other DPS bows for everything besides charge shots and normal attacks. For example, the Polar Star provides the highest average damage Childe damage for everything besides his normal attacks, of which the Thundering Pulse is a bit better. As for all the other bow characters, if you're willing to spend the extra second to build 2 stacks with a normal attack and charge attack, then the Polar Star outperforms everything else for average elemental skill and elemental burst damage. This is why you see all the DPS bows being ranked so close to each other, because all of them have their niches where they are slightly better than the other, with the exception being the Amos bow, which is hard carried by Ganyu. And I figured I would just also clarify the Polar Star is not really recommended for Yoimiya. Alright, now with the high quality selection of bows out of the way, let's take a look at the much more sad collection of 5-star catalysts that we have available to us. I'm going to make this section quick and painless for all of us, and throw the Skyward Atlas, the Lost Prayer to the Sacred Winds, and the Memory of Dust all into the second lowest tier for each tier list. Sadly, not only are none of the DPS Catalyst users considered to be top tier today, but they also have the Widsith and the Dodoko Tails to choose from. The Widsith with refinements is situationally better than any of these 5-star weapons, and the Dodoko Tails is about as good as a Refinement 1 Skyward Atlas. On top of all that, support Catalyst users all have the Thrilling Tails to abuse. I put the Lost Prayer at the top of the Catalyst because I believe it is just very slightly better than the others, as it provides the very valuable crit rate substat to help balance your crit ratio. But needing to be on field for 16 seconds to get its full buff is not very good. That leaves us with the last 5-star catalyst, the Everlasting Moonglow. This weapon is only good for Kokomi, and increases her low damage output by just a little bit. The impact it has on your account is very small, and as such, it goes straight into the lowest tier for a free-to-play account. However, for dolphins trying to min-max their Kokomi, and with a few refinements, the Donut is a solid choice for Kokomi. And as such, I am placing this for dolphins in the second to last tier. With the tragic selection of catalysts out of the way, it's time to talk about the Claymores of Genshin Impact. Starting off with the Skyward Pride. The Skyward Pride is a decent, well-rounded claymore. It's a solid weapon on physical damage Claymore characters like Eula, Razor, and Xinyan, and its energy recharge is useful for a burst-dependent character like Beidou, Eula, Razor, etc. However, it is not considered to be best in slot for any character, and instead is simply just a decent choice. This lands it in the B tier for both lists. As for the Dolphin Plus list, the Skyward Pride is a good option on Eula if you really want to push that energy recharge for her, and the Vacuum Blades can add a lot of extra damage. Next we have the Wolf's Gravestone. The Wolf's Gravestone is both a solid DPS weapon and an occasionally good support weapon. It also happens to be universally good, and even best in slot for many Claymore characters. Now you might hear all that and wonder why it's only in the A tier for both the lists. And that's because while it is often the best in slot weapon for characters like Diluc, Beidou, and sometimes Xinyan and even Eula, Claymores lack a powerful universal crit substat weapon. The Wolf's Gravestone party buff, while amazing, is also very situational, often activating when you no longer need it. However, because of the universality of this weapon, it is an extremely valuable Claymore to own on your account. The Unforged is surprisingly very similar to the Wolf's Gravestone, sporting the same base attack and the same attack buff at 5 stacks without a shield. However, with a shield, the Unforged with 5 stacks becomes better than the Wolf's Gravestone without its buff. With all that being said though, needing to build stacks and needing a shield lowers this weapon's overall usefulness compared to the Wolf's Gravestone. As such, I'm putting this weapon in the B tier on both tier lists. However, it's worth noting that there are some niche scenarios where this weapon is the best option. For example, Diluc with Zhongli after building 5 stacks against the target, and where most of the fight is against the target while it has 30% or more HP. Now this is pretty specific, but it does happen on enemies like the Magu Kenki and the Perpetual Mechanical Array. Now for the Song of Broken Pines, which is often considered to be Eula's signature weapon. The Song of Broken Pines is an amazing weapon for Eula and for Razor as well, but as a DPS weapon, it's only really good for physical DPS characters, of which Eula is considered to be the most meta-defining. This weapon goes into the A tier for both tier lists as well, but behind the Wolf's Gravestone. The reason for this is because the Wolf's Gravestone happens to be Eula's best in slot in many scenarios as well. In particular, ones where Eula can tag a less than 30% HP monster for her burst. Regardless, you'll see a big power spike with the Song of Broken Pines on Eula if you don't have the Wolf's Gravestone or the Unforged. On top of that, it can occasionally be used as a support weapon, which I sometimes use on my Sayu for fun. The last Claymore is the Red Horn Stone Thresher. I'm going to tentatively place this thing in the A tier. Similarly to the Amos bow, the Red Horn Stone Thresher will be carried by the main DPSs that use it, and in this case it's likely that both Arataki Ito and Noelle will be able to utilize it. However, as of making this tier list, this weapon has not been released yet and its stats have not been confirmed, so please keep that in mind. And now for, in my opinion, the most power crept category of weapons, the Polearms. Let's start off with one of the OG Polearms, the Primordial Jade Winged Spear. This weapon has the much coveted crit rate substat, and its passive is a solid one to boot. However, as we've seen with most weapons that have a time-gated stack building mechanic, I can't put it in the highest tier. As such, it lands itself in the A tier. While a very solid option, even for Xiao, the Primordial Jade Winged Spear is only situationally the best weapon option for him. For other characters like Zhongli, Xiangling, and even for Hu Tao's burst, building stacks can be impractical, and as such, the Primordial Jade Winged Spear can often be considered to simply have 0 to 2 stacks. Next we have arguably the saddest 5-star in the entire game, the Skyward Spine. In a vacuum, the Skyward Spine is not a terrible weapon. However, all players will have access to the catch, and the catch is basically this weapon. What's doubly sad is that all the other 5-star polearms do a lot more damage than this thing does, and the free-to-play weapon, the catch, does about the same amount of damage for elemental bursts. Because this has been power crept by other polearms and is the same in performance as the free-to-play weapon, the catch, the Skyward Spine is a contender for one of the worst 5-star weapons in the game. Arguably, the only use for this thing is if you want to use both Xiangling and Raiden at the same time, and you only have one of the catch. And now for another tragedy and perhaps the biggest scam weapon banner in Genshin Impact history, the Vortex Vanquisher. This weapon was released before we knew any better, and is another stack building shield weapon. Sadly, this weapon is completely power crept by the next weapon, the Staff of Homa. which unconditionally does around the same amount of damage without the shield requirement. And because this is completely power crept and has literally no situation where this is your best weapon option, except for making your shield more durable, this is another 5-star polearm that's going into the lowest tier on this list. And that's the perfect segue to one of the most powerful weapons in the game, the Staff of Homa. From a raw damage perspective, minus Raiden, the Staff of Homa is either always or often the best option for raw damage. This thing unconditionally boosts all types of damage and skyrockets your damage when you're under 50% HP. 3 of the best characters in the game, Zhongli, Hu Tao, and Xiangling, all love having the Staff of Homa. And other high tier characters like Rosaria and Xiao can utilize it well as well. In fact, even Toma loves having the Staff of Toma. As such, because this weapon is the best option for so many characters and scenarios, this thing is going straight into the S tier on both tier lists. And last but not least, we have the Engulfing Lightning. For free-to-plays, I believe the Engulfing Lightning deserves an A tier placement. Meanwhile, for Dolphin Pluses, I believe it deserves an S tier placement. For free-to-plays, while this weapon is the best option for Raiden and is a great option for Xiangling, the power gain compared to the catch is relatively small for the Primo Gems spent. You'd be better off going for Constellation 2 or even Constellation 3 on Raiden before going for the Engulfing Lightning. However, assuming you have Constellation 3 for Dolphin Pluses, then this weapon will help bring your Raiden above and beyond, as any additional damage you stack on top of a Constellation 3 Raiden's damage will further skyrocket her damage into even more broken levels. And finally, the Engulfing Lightning is a great universal weapon, especially when paired with the Emblem of Severed Fates artifact set. Alright, so that covers all the 5-star weapons up to this point, as well as my speculative placement of the Red Horn Stone Thresher. We can see that the 2 tier lists are similar, but with the free-to-play tier list focusing more on universally good weapons, while the Dolphin Plus tier list has a stronger emphasis on team buffing weapons. We can also see the difference in placement for the Shield series weapons between the weapon types, mostly due to alternative options for the various characters. And we can also see some discrepancies between whether or not a weapon is recommended to be pulled for free-to-plays, as well as whether or not this weapon is best in specific scenarios. And lastly, I really hope to see some new meta catalyst users as well as new catalysts introduced, because our current selection is nothing short of a tragedy. Also, I regularly make Genshin Impact videos ranging from Caesar showcases, DPS showdowns, guide videos, and more. So be sure to smash the subscribe button, as it's the best and easiest way for you to support my work. Also, don't forget to like the video and leave a comment for the YouTube algorithm. What do you think about my weapon placements in these tier lists? Let me know in the comments below. As always, I appreciate every single one of you. This is I Want to Lose, signing out.